Well, last week, Stephen Harper was in Ukraine, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany, making Canada's case that Russia's actions in Crimea were unacceptable. Harper may well be the most traveled prime minister in the country's history. Does traveling the globe produce rewards, or are there risks? The insiders are here on that tonight. Jamie, Kathleen, and David, all here in Toronto this evening. But before we get to that topic, Dimitri Soudas, somebody you all know, close friend, associate, and confidant of the Prime Minister, gets fired as Executive Director of the Conservative Party of Canada. Here we are in the run-up to the next federal election, over issues about whether or not he was, or that they said he was too involved in a campaign that had featured his fiancée for the nomination of the party in their Toronto riding, something which he was not supposed to do. It's a fascinating story, and I'm trying to understand what the lesson of this issue is. Kathleen.
Well, first of all, I'd say that there's nothing that focuses the mind more than realizing that you're 18 months out from the election, that nominations are now opening, and you have to remember that because of redistribution, many of these ridings have changed. Some of them literally are going to be divided into 3. So the incumbents necessarily are kind of worried about where they're going to run. They want to make sure they have their best chances. But I think what the story, what we can learn from this is that the Prime Minister made some rules and he's sticking by them. That said, we have to wonder, with the number of resignations or firings that are stacking up from Nigel Wright to Soudas to even Bruce Carson before that, whether it starts reflecting back on the Prime Minister himself.
Nice voice you've got this week.
Sorry. Yeah, apologies.
David.
I think that, though, there's lots of lessons you can potentially learn. I would focus on 2 of them. One of which is that although this has something to do with a pre-election run and some tensions within a party in a pre-election run, it also has a lot to do with fin de regime. And as governments get old, generally the talent pool diminishes over time. And leaders in their 10th year are rarely surrounded by as much talent as they were in their first year. And I think that what we're seeing is some of that with Mr. Harper, is that he's getting down to the short straws in the talent bank. And the second thing that anybody who might be thinking about replacing Mr. Soudas, I think, should think about is the brutality with which the firing happened and the way it all gets leaked out afterwards. And I think it's part of a piece, which is one has to conclude that if you work for Mr. Harper and you get into any kind of trouble, he's not going to carry any water for you whatsoever. He will not spend any political capital on you. You will be dispensed with in a brutal fashion. Too sweet. So those are, I think, 2 lessons to learn from what happened this week.
Especially now at this point, after the 10 years and with the party down in the polls.
Right.
Dimitri Soudas had been involved in complicated issues in the past, but was always,
that's tolerance for it now.
Was always protected. Now, this panel tries to be nonpartisan in the way it goes about things for the purposes of letting the public get an inside look at how things operate. Those comments, Jamie, after all, this is your party they're talking about. Fair comment?
Yeah, I think what's taking place is a result of 2 things. One, which is a fundamental change, and one, which is a transitory change and is just in place right now. So dealing with the second one first, every time you change riding boundaries, you cause all kinds of problems. And of course, you cause the problems for the party that has the most seats to begin with. So back in 1995 in Ontario, when Premier Harris collapsed the number of ridings, we had very similar problems. So you're going to see that now when you redraw those boundaries federally. So that's a one-time thing. But I think the second thing is this reflects, sort of the new reality where political parties are becoming more ruthless. We saw it with Mr. McNaughton making some choices for Liberals in Ontario, where people are just not prepared to let these things go on. So in the old days, you might have had a little bit more elasticity or tolerance. Now, the Prime Minister called in his lawyer, Mr. Guy Giorgio, and he got a report from him, and then that was it.
That Harper-Harris slip of the tongue, that was
one of Freudian things,
that was just an accident. Okay, I want to shift topics to the main one on today, which is this issue of when you showcase your leader in an international situation. Obviously, prime ministers get a lot of that showcasing simply by the nature of their job and invitations to summits and what have you. But this prime minister is become quite the world traveler. Before we discuss it, watch this. Not surprisingly, the Prime Minister is the most traveled of the current three national leaders. In fact, if his government plane offered travel reward points, he'd likely get years of free trips. In the past 12 months alone, Stephen Harper has been all over the world. As far away as Korea last month, and as close as New York City last year. But in between, there have been lots of trips. Germany, the Netherlands, Israel, Mexico, Jordan, Belgium, twice, Indonesia, Malaysia, Russia, Ireland, France,
for Canada and
England, twice, Colombia, Peru, Ukraine, and South Africa. Tom Mulcair was on that South Africa trip too, part of the delegation to the Mandela funeral. Also last year, Mulcair went to Paris and Washington. And Justin Trudeau, he's ventured outside only once in his first year as Liberal leader. That was to Washington. All right, so there's a snapshot of the past year, keeping in mind opposition leaders have to travel commercial. When they go on their touring, prime ministers, of course, fly in a government jet. Risk and reward. David, what's the upside of all this travel?
The upside is that you get to be set in situations that make you look like a leader, that are generally less adversarial or controversial or confrontational than you're in the political situation back in Canada. And you get, if you're an opposition leader, a chance to burnish your credentials as somebody that could lead the country. And you, if you're the sitting prime minister, you get to get out of the maelstrom of political Ottawa and get into some territory where you can look a little bit more statesmanlike. Are the rewards? The risks, I think, are, other than the diaspora, various circumstances in Canada, Canadians don't care about foreign policy. And I think that a lot of these leaders are deluding themselves. It happens quite often as governments get long in the tooth. You know, Mr. Trudeau had his peace mission. They think that they can rehabilitate themselves to Canadians by looking statesmanlike abroad. And I think, frankly, they just find it more comfortable over there. It's a kind of a clubby group of leaders who all support each other and tell each other nice things. And it's a lot more comfortable than it is here. But I don't think it helps their electoral prospects really at all, to be honest.
I think the risks the rewards, rather, are clearer for the Prime Minister than they are for opposition leaders. The rewards for the Prime Minister, you've got media corralled, you can control the images, you can control the timing and the events that happen. So it's actually a great publicity stunt for Prime Ministers. For opposition leaders, it's not so clear. It's harder to get media for opposition leaders when they're abroad, and they are limited in terms of where they can travel. They normally travel to New York, Washington, London, places where they can talk about finance or politics. And that's because they're looking, as David said, to kind of burnish their foreign policy credentials or their economic credentials. And that's what you saw with Mulcair going to Washington and New York.
The trouble, though, for them, opposition leaders, is getting those meetings with presidents and prime ministers on these various trips. Jamie, when you look at these, what do you see?
Well, not to take anything away from my colleagues' points, they're all terribly important reasons to travel. I think they travel because they like it. You know, there's an adage that says every leader...
But they do seem to like it the longer they're in office. They do.
Well, that's the adage is they come to office as domestic prime ministers, domestic presidents. This isn't unique to Canada. And they leave office as international leaders, and they get treated better. The big fuss is made over them. No pesky reporters asking them questions. They just simply like it. And there's a chart that can show the travel increases as long as they're in office. Now, there's also sometimes things are useful to them. For example, I can't remember if it was last year or year before, the Prime Minister used his speech in Davos to lay out major changes, pensions and others. And so he got a chance to have like a big speech. And sometimes people who are not in power use it to burnish their foreign policy bona fides. Remember when Barack Obama gave that huge speech, a couple 100,000 people in 2008 in Berlin.
Berlin's been good to American presidents.
Yes, exactly. 63 JFK Kennedy, and 87 Ronald Reagan, right? It's been very good to them.
Bring that wall down. What about David's point, though, that, you know, for the most part, Canadians really don't care. They're disconnected from foreign issues when they go to the ballot box. So it doesn't do anything for them in terms of who they may end up voting for.
Well, that's true in most cases, but there is some political engineering that happens in some of these foreign travel trips. I would say even this most recent trip for the Prime Minister to Ukraine, there's 1.2 million Ukrainians or people of Ukrainian descent here in Canada, and they're largely in urban centres, Toronto, Edmonton, and these will be ridings that will be fought over in the next election. So it's important for him to do those travels to show that he's speaking to that community. I think that one thing to be said about how Prime Minister Harper has been traveling is it's been much more surgical in terms of he's been in and out. His trips aren't as long as Prime Minister Chrétien's trips, which are these kind of lengthy 12-day trips with, you know, lots of business people and premiers would come along, his Captain Canada team trips, where he would actually build in some tourism for the journalists as well. Harper's known for being very surgical, in and out, and get out of Dodge.
Peter, even if those pictures that you played don't help advance the vote, right? As long as you're showing those pictures and not pictures that are troublesome to the government, that's also a pretty good day for
Dimitri Soudas wasn't in one of those shots.
Exactly.
That's right.
No, but he might have been in another story on the news. And when the Prime Minister's away, the other thing that happens is that authority diminishes in the government in Ottawa. And especially in this government where the Prime Minister is very hands-on in managing the political situations of his government. I imagine that the longer he's away, there's some risk in that too.
All right, we got to leave it at that for tonight, though. Thank you all.